What is the best nation in Cossacks 3? Well, today I'm going to answer this for you guys. For each nation I will consider early, mid and late game, and then they will be assigned a tier. Starting off with Algeria. Now this isn't a great start. Early game for Algeria is actually quite good because they can spam units with their fast production speed, but after around 15 minutes of in-game time, they quickly become one of the worst nations. This is because they have no access to 18th century, they have no access to any muskets, and they only have four military units in their whole nation. This puts Algeria firmly in the F tier. Now we go into the better version of Algeria, Turkey. Turkey and Algeria share a lot of the same things. No 18th century, similar building costs, and similar units. But what Turkey does better is that they actually have some musketeers. And they have really good cavalry units, like the heavy Sipahi. And if you like naval battles, they have really good yachts too. Like Algeria, Turkey is one of the best early game nations. And it falls off towards the 18th century unfortunately. But I wouldn't say it falls off nearly as bad as Algeria. In my opinion, Turkey could possibly be the best early game nation within the game. And this puts them in A tier. Moving on to Scotland, my home nation. And the last of which, they don't have access to the 18th century. Scotland is probably the most unique nation within the whole game, but does that mean it's any good? It has a researchable balloon from the start of the game, it has the fastest infantry, and the only unique artillery. Scotland is strongest in the early mid part of the game, with strong 17th century units like the Clansmen, but all these units are not fast to produce. If you manage to build a good economy fast, and get plenty of production buildings, then Scotland can be a threat with a combination of fast moving clansmen and raiders. Otherwise, it's just fun to play for something different. And this means Scotland goes in C tier. Now we have Austria, another unique nation, and possibly the most flexible nation within the game. Austria has access to the most units in the game, allowing them to adapt to any game situation. Also, having extremely fast building town halls allows them to get an early head start. Austrian round shears are probably the best meat shields in the game. Their armour makes them tough to take down in front of musketeers, and their Croats are good 17th century cavalry with their speed. As for the Panzers, I would stick to regular musketeers due to the Panzers having slower production speed and no bayonet despite more damage. Overall, Austria is a very balanced nation, and can do well at most points in the game, but maybe not exceed. And this puts them in A tier, above Turkey. Next up is Bavaria, the first of the late game nations. Bavaria is not a good early game nation, due to expensive pikeman upgrades and their standard production times. But as the game progresses, Bavaria becomes stronger with their 18th century musketeers being better than the standard ones, as they have better damage and range, and a slightly slower production time. Apart from this, Bavaria is fairly standard. If you manage to survive the early game, you will have a very dependable nation, and this puts Bavaria in B tier. And the next late game nation is Denmark. Denmark is very similar to Bavaria, with the only difference being that their musketeers go all in on damage at the cost of reload speed. This makes Denmark better for situations where they face high HP enemies like heavy cavalry, for example the Cuirassier. But overall I would say Denmark is just below Bavaria because of the harder playstyle. England is the next nation on this list, one of the best naval nations. It has several upgrade discounts and can research battleships the fastest out of any nation. It also has a plethora of cavalry upgrade discounts, making it easier to get high quality cavalry out fast. England's unique units are nothing to write home about though. For example, the Highlanders. They're good, but I would stick to 18th century musketeers. If you're a fan of naval maps, then England is a good choice. Other than that, it's pretty average, so I'd put it in B tier behind Denmark. England's old rival France is up next with a heavy focus on firepower. All three of France's unique units are range units, with all three being very good. The King's Musketeer with the most range damage in the game, the Chasseur, the best skirmisher in the game, and the 18th century Dragoon with the fastest production. Now it does come at the cost of HP and damage, but if you manage to get up enough of an army, which you will because of the production speed, it more than makes up for it. France does not suffer upgrade penalties like some of the other late game nations, but can work pretty well in the late game, despite having regular 18th century musketeers. France does not suffer any of the upgrade penalties like other late game nations, but can work pretty well in the late game, with very little cons, a lot of pros, and being a solid pick for early, mid and late game. France is the first S tier nation on this list. And next up is Hungary. If you like fast cavalry, then Hungary's hussars are for you, as they are the strongest hussars in the game. Hungary's unique range units are not bad. The 17th century Hajduk has very fast production and reload time, but bad range and damage. This means Hungary can be good early mid-game with a large army of Hajduks and hussars. But with some standard 18th century musketeers, they aren't bad in the 18th century either. I think Hungary is an okay pick, but there's definitely better nations in the game, and for that reason, they go in B tier, right behind England. Now we have the Netherlands, a very similar nation to France, in that they focus all on firepower. The Netherlands has the best 17th century musketeer in the whole game. With a faster production speed and reload speed, this makes our nation not really need pikemen, which negates the higher upgrade cost that they have. Unless, of course, you're attacked instantly, then you're screwed. Having to solely focus on range units can also help a lot of newer or inexperienced players. A mix between the strong 17th century musketeers and the 18th century musketeers can create a very high quality army from the early game all the way to the late game. The Netherlands also have extremely beefy 18th century musketeers with less attack damage, which unfortunately means that they're not great. With all that said, Netherlands belongs in the A tier, above Austria. Now we have Piedmont. Now, Piedmont isn't necessarily a bad nation, it just doesn't do anything good or bad. Their gameplay is completely standard, apart from the fact they have a unique healer and their Dragoon is slightly better. If I got Piedmont from a random nation, I wouldn't be unhappy, but there's probably a nation that would do what you want better. And for those reasons, it goes in C tier, behind Scotland. Moving on to the last proper early game nation, Poland. Poland's pikemen train extremely fast, and getting an early army of them can enable you to crush your opponents fast. Plus, if you manage to train enough winged hussars, you'll be unstoppable early on. There is also the unique 17th century musketeer, but due to them having the lowest range damage, I would stay away from them. Poland falls off towards the late game, but not nearly as bad as other early game nations as they have access to 18th century. Poland is a more comfortable nation than Turkey due to the 18th century access, and for that reason I will put them just above them in A tier. If naval maps are your favourite and you won't play anything else, then Portugal is the nation for you. They are the only nation which fires cannons from their shipyards, which grants a huge bonus early game, and in games without artillery or towers. Portugal also has good 17th century pikemen, and an average spammable 18th century range unit, the Volunteer. Due to Portugal being the best at naval maps, and just above average at everything else, it goes in A tier, behind Turkey. Next up is the famous Prussia. Now Prussia has a reputation for being the best late game nation in the game, and that is absolutely correct. Their 18th century musketeers are the very best in the game, while still staying balanced in their stats. The only downside is its very slow production speed, and it's the nation that takes the longest to build a large army. Prussia, of course, suffers from the high pikeman upgrade costs, but if you manage to survive into the mid-late game, you'll most likely dominate. Prussia also has very strong hussars, which work well with their musketeers. They train faster and have slightly more health. Despite having a lot of early game struggles, the late game for Prussia speaks for itself, and that means it goes in S tier, behind France. Another unique nation is Russia. Russia can build a lot of barracks in the early game, which means in the mid game, it can have a huge army of pikemen. Russia unfortunately has no access to 17th century dragoons, which is the strongest range unit in that century. Their 17th century musketeers can be good in large numbers with their improved health, but they stay unattractive to me with low range and production speed. Because Russia has 18th century, it stays somewhat relevant towards the late game too. Overall, Russia is a unique nation, but it lacks firepower to keep it high on the list, so for that reason, it goes in C tier, above Piedmont. Saxony is the last late game nation on this list, and it isn't tied as much to the late game as other late game nations, due to their pikemen upgrades being only slightly more than normal. It is a good alternative to Prussia if you don't want to wait as long to build up your army. Its improved 18th century musketeers with fast reloading speed and good production speed make sure you're very strong in the late game. Saxony also has the only unique cuirassier in the game, the Cavalry Guard, which is an extremely tanky unit to put on your front lines with your musketeers behind. Due to this powerful combo and very little downsides, that puts Saxony at the top of A tier. Next is Spain, which is a quality over quantity nation. They have the absolute best early game pikemen, with the only downside being that they take longer to train. Also, their musketeers are armoured too, which can help in the early game. Unfortunately, when you progress to the 18th century, everything becomes standard again. Although your 17th century can still do a good job with some 18th century musketeers behind them, I would say there's better options. Due to not being able to make a large army fast, Spain can sometimes get overrun by their opponents. And for that reason, I'm going to put Spain in B tier, behind Denmark. The next nation is Sweden, which is very similar to Piedmont in the fact that it's very standard. It has 2 unique cavalry units, which are just meh, and the only unique 18th century pikeman unit, which is slightly stronger. Which is cool, I guess. Overall, Sweden's buffs are pretty pointless, and they don't offer enough for you to pick them over any other nation in the game. And for that reason, they go in F tier, above Algeria. Next up is Switzerland, which do pretty well from the early game all the way to the late game. Their 17th century pikemen have fast upgrades, high damage, but slightly slower production time. Their 18th century Jaeger has the longest range in the game, plus high damage. They also have very strong hussars, although they cost more. Switzerland can be strong at any point in the game with some decent pros and very little cons. And for that reason, I'm going to put them in A tier, behind Saxony. And the final unique nation is Ukraine. Like Scotland, Ukraine has no access to the 18th century, but has access to the balloon. The early game is quite bad for Ukraine because of no access to pikemen, but once you get some upgrades on your musketeers, you become one of the best nations in the mid game. Although you slow down in the late game. Ukraine's unique units are very good, with the Sergiuk being one of the best 17th century musketeers. Creating large thick Cossack armies can wreak havoc on opposing economies. And their hetman have a crazy base 70 damage. Their buildings are also very cheap, and their academy builds very fast. If you can adjust your playstyle and become experienced with Ukraine, you can become extremely strong. Ukraine is a hard nation to rank, but I would put them in A tier just above Poland, because I believe that they are the best nation that doesn't have access to the 18th century. And finally, we have the most interesting nation of all. Just kidding, it's Venice. Venice is the most standard and generic nation in the game. They have no pros, no cons, no unique units, just the standard European roster of units and buildings. This doesn't mean Venice is bad though, and I would say it's the absolute best nation for new players of Cossacks 3. But there's just so many nations I'd rather play, maybe even Algeria. So it goes in C tier, behind Russia. Well, that's it for my tier list on the best nations in Cossacks 3. I'd like to shout out Pirate Mike as he has some great guides on Steam, and also a couple of the Discord guys that helped me make final adjustments to the list. Let me know what you thought of these rankings, and you can rank your own top 5 in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.